joining Bible Theory once again. This is your host, the Chicano Knox, coming live and direct from the Reform Underground Studios. And for those who don't know, my podcast analytics keeps getting bigger and bigger because of the grace of God, not because I'm a somebody. I'm actually a nobody. You know what I mean? And I'm just a dad and dude, just like you. Interested in theology, specifically ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church, learning about it, studying it, bringing it to you, reintroducing it to many. According to analytics, I just broke through France and Puerto Rico. So thank you for everybody in France. Thank you for todo mi gente in Puerto Rico. I see you. So don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and on YouTube. Hit the like and subscribe button because that goes a long way for the algorithm. And don't forget to support Bible Theory by buying me a coffee. I'll drop the link in the description below. Okay, with this, I've been waiting to talk about this for a while. I actually did talk about this once back in season 2 with the episode Let's Talk About Demographics. Now we're going to return to this subject, something that kind of sparked, or should I say helped start my journey in thinking about ecclesiology when I was studying human geography and human, demographics and all that stuff. And, I found a correlation, and this was what this episode was about. And I brought somebody very special with me on here today to help me talk about this. And it's Sam Rayner. Sam, thank you so much for your time and, just your flexibility just to come on here and talk about demographics, an issue that many people, one, don't know about, and two, maybe don't even care about. So real quick, for people who don't know you, can you introduce yourself? Tell my audience who you are and what you do.
Yeah, well, I'm very grateful to be on the show, and thank you for inviting me. Honored to join you. I run a company called Church Answers, and I'm also a local church pastor. I mean, if you're going to summarize it pretty quickly, I'm a dad as well. So shout out to all the dads. At the time of this recording, Father's Day is tomorrow. So
happy Father's Day.
Not sure when everyone will be listening, but to all of the fathers out there, you are appreciated and your role is very important. So I'm a dad, I'm a pastor, I'm a researcher, I'm a business owner. And president of Church Answers, lead pastor of West Bradenton Baptist. And I love what I do. I'm honored to be able to have a co-vocational role. I define bivocational as the church can't pay full-time for whatever reason. Co-vocational, the church can, but by choice, I kind of have two vocations. So I consider myself co-vocational, being president of Church Answers and the lead pastor of West Bradenton. Love what I do at my company, and I absolutely love my church and my family as well. So grateful to have an amazing wife, 5 children, and 5 because we foster. So we've got 3 biological, 1 adopted, 1 foster right now, and they're great kids. So happy Father's Day to me. Happy Father's Day to you and to all the listeners as well.
Amen. And Feliz Dia de los Padres to everybody in Puerto Rico, Mexico, all those people out there. Real quick, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but I heard by a little bird tweet, should I say, that you actually maybe follow the Tampa Bay Lightning. Is that true or is that false?
Yeah. I live in the Tampa Bay area.
Okay.
And okay. I grew up in St. Pete, off of 28th Street. Mm-hmm, and remember when the Trop, what was the Suncoast Dome, was built, became the Thunderdome when the Lightning moved in, and now they're at Amalie in Tampa. So big Tampa Bay Rays fan and a big Lightning fan, and they are in the Stanley Cup Finals. They lost the first game, but hopefully they can pull it together.
I'm in the Rocky area, you know what I mean? I'm not a huge hockey guy, but whenever I do hear, any of the teams of the Rockies, the Broncos, anything like that, I have to, put my 2 cents in and be like, go Rockies, go Avalanche, whatever. But I just wanted to put that out there, you know what I mean? Because I did see that. So
the Avalanche are tough this year. That's a good team. We, game 1's done. I think game 2 is tonight at the time of this recording. So
yeah, absolutely. And I've seen them come up. I've seen them get young guys, and I've seen them focus on young raw players that are actually really good. And being a non-hockey guy, I grew up on the Mighty Ducks watching that movie, so that's the only hockey history I got. It's just, you know what I mean. So watching them
Good
going to
movie.
the Stanley, yeah, watching the Avs go to the Stanley, I'm like, oh, that's good, I guess. Good for them, I guess. But anyways, so tell us what Church Answers. A little bit about Church Answers. Like, why did you start that ministry or business? What kind of services it provides? Who is the target audience or niche that you're trying to build?
Yeah, so Church Answers is a resource provider for churches, particularly church leaders. We have several different ways of serving churches. We do certifications for things like church consulting. So if you want to be a church consultant, we can certify you, interim pastors as well, church revitalizers. So we have several certifications. We also have a membership where you get access to any number of resources, including Church Answers Central, which is our forum where we have 2,000 pastors interacting with each other on a regular basis. We do some single resources and tools. I know the purpose of this podcast is demographics. We provide a demographic report for churches. So you can go to churchanswers.com. You'll see a little tab up at the top that says demographic reports. We have a very good resource called the Know Your Community report, which tells you all about your community. And we can talk more about that if you like. And we also provide not only certifications and membership and tools, but community as well for pastors and church leaders that are looking to connect on issues that are practical church health. That's what we do. Practical church leadership, practical church health. I am a theologian because I'm a pastor, but most people don't come to me for theological help. There's people that are better at it than I am. But where I can help is with issues like cantankerous deacons, financial statements, structure issues, operational issues, all sorts of things that makes the church run on a daily basis.
You mean people don't surround you in the parking lot and ask you about the hypostatic union or anything like that?
I have had those questions within my congregation. I'm always glad to answer them. But my niche, my world is more on the leadership side of things. I do know what the hypostatic union is, and I do have an opinion on it. Well, not only an opinion, a conviction. But I'm not the world's renowned theologian on that particular issue.
All right. So let's go ahead and get right into it, because time is precious and time is ticking. I want to go ahead and get into this issue of demographics. First of all, give us a little synopsis from a biblical understanding of what demographics is, because there's a secular view. If you study human geography, stuff like that, they kind of just take God out of the picture. They take God out of everything. That's based on my studies on human geography. And it's like, it's all connected from what I understand, and a web. It's a wide topic. It's kind of deep because it kind of touches a lot of different things, spills over to different categories, like politics, philosophy, gets into all kinds of stuff, agriculture, if you ever study human geography. But like what I took away from my studies on human geo was like the Lord is missing, the providence of God is missing. The redemption of man is missing. They have a wrong anthropology, all those type of things. But, can you give us a quick synopsis of human geo from a Christian perspective for those who have no idea what demographics is?
Yeah. So let's define some terms first. Demographics is who people are. Psychographics is what people prefer. And that's a very basic definition. If you were to take a course in anthropology, sociology, even statistics, you're going to dive much deeper than that. But demographics, who people are. Are you Caucasian? Are you Hispanic? Are you Black? Are you male? Are you female? It's who you are. Those are things you cannot change about yourself. Demographics, generally speaking. Psychographics is what you prefer. So I lean right or I lean left politically. I prefer a Baptist church over a Presbyterian church. Those are psychographics. Now, when you're talking about what's a biblical perspective of all that, well, it goes back to the Missio Dei, the mission of God. And you cannot reach your community for Christ unless you know your community. This is Missiology 101. This is if you are called to a cross-cultural environment. So let's say, I had a cousin that was a missionary in Japan. and he went to Japan. He was called there without any experience. So he, of being over there. So he had to learn the language. He had to learn the culture, and he had to understand, how he needs to fit as an American into a Japanese culture. Those are all very important missiological questions and sociological questions as well. So he did that because he was called to win people for Christ in Japan. So demographics, who people are, psychographics, what people prefer, help you know how to do the mission of God. And this is a very basic thing, and I find this in churches a lot. So we do a lot of consultation at Church Answers. That's another thing we do is church consultations. And one of the most basic parts of the church consultation is, pulling a demographic report on their area. And so our demographic report actually is based upon drive time. I mean, that's how most people think. We are 20 minutes from this particular spot, 15 minutes from this particular spot. And what we're learning through some recent studies is that people are not willing to drive as far to church as they once did. And so that church that's 5-10 minutes from everyone is very important. So our demographic reports are based on a 10-minute drive time or a 15-minute drive time. And you can learn, who is within that community. And one of the most basic things that I found is I'll ask the church leader, whoever I'm working with, all right, how many people live within 10 minutes of your church? Like, what's your mission field? What is the size of your mission field? Forget all of the nuances of culture. Just how many people are here? And amazingly, almost nobody can even say just how many people are in their field. So demographics is a very important part of just understanding your mission field, something even as basic as how many. And most people greatly underestimate really three things. One, how many people are there? Most people think their communities are much smaller. How young their communities are. Most people think that they tend to be older. And how ethnically diverse their communities are. Most people who are white tend to think that their communities are whiter than they are. So those are the three big areas that are often missed. Now, our reports go into much more detail than that. They're almost 40 pages long, full of data. But even the most basic things, people don't understand. And if you don't understand your community, you can't reach your community. It's very hard to connect, to build that bridge into the community. That's why demographics and psychographics are so important.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. That's actually a very important point. Studying church planting is actually, you have to look at what your community looks like. The context matters. In real estate, location. Well, I think in church planting, it's like, community, because you want to, you're there to plant a church, right? If you really want to get into church planting, it's like, well, why are you planting a church? It's one, because the church in that area, there's no church in that area. You want to go be the church in that area. You want to start that church in area, and I feel like in the beginning of many churches, at least here, let's say in many churches in Denver, there's a lot of people that are like, okay, we're going to plant a church here in this local area because we have a vision that, that drives our passion for this area. We want to reach these like 8 blocks, right? Radius, right? And then like 20 years down the road, because of many different reasons, culture shifts, whatever, it feels like many churches kind of lose that initial church plant initiative of why they went to that neighborhood or 8 block square radius in the first place. And then all of a sudden it's like, then they catch themselves, not all the time, but they catch themselves stuck. Like, why people are not coming here? What's going on? Why can't we reach our neighbors? And then all of a sudden they find themselves reaching, Russia or Antarctica or some other region. And not to say that's bad or they shouldn't do that, but it's like, for me, I'm like, isn't that like studying church planting churches? It feels like, you should be heavily concentrated, at least prioritizing those 8 blocks a lot more than, reaching Russia. It's kind of like maybe a lot of churches stop subconsciously reaching the 8 blocks and then they start reaching Russia, for example. And I'm not saying don't reach Russia. Russia needs the gospel too. Well, I'm just saying, like, for me, it feels like a lot of modern churches catch themselves 20 years after the church plant in this situation. In your experience, what do you have to say to that? What are the potential pitfalls for those type of imbalances when you stop reaching your own demographic in your backyard, for example, and then you focus on other demographics? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, every local church has a global mandate. So we're called to the nations, and we call ourselves at West Bradenton a neighborhood church for the nations. So there's really two parts to the mission of God. You have your neighborhood, which, as you said, is just like 8 blocks right around you. That's what we focus on here at West Bradenton. And then you have the calling to make disciples of all peoples and all places. Now, every church can't go every place, of course. You can't go to every nation, but you do have a call to the nations in the sense that you're called outward from yourself,
Right.
not only to your neighborhood, to the nations. But you brought up a great point, because a lot of churches do neglect the neighborhood right around them. And what we're seeing actually is a decline in the large regional church. Mega churches, things like that. And it's not just mega churches, but the large regional church that's trying to draw people from an hour away. These churches, if you ask them, who's your mission field locally, they'll say, well, people from an hour away. And that movement's waning, and we can see that in the data. I won't bore you with all the data, but there's probably about half as many mega churches after the pandemic as there was before, and that there was not much growth in the number of megachurches really since 2010. So what that means is that there's an opportunity to refocus on the neighborhoods. If people are not going to drive as far to church, if people are not as attracted to these large regional churches like the baby boomers were. So the megachurch movement was a baby boomer phenomenon. They were filled with baby boomers. Most people think they're younger. They're not. They're actually older. And that means that we have an opportunity as a neighborhood church. You have an opportunity as a local church to reach the people right around you. Now, people aren't going to flock back into your church just because it's a neighborhood church or just because it's a little smaller. You have to do the work of evangelism. You have to do the work of outreach. You have to do the work of serving your community. But there's the stigma is going away of smaller churches, which I love. That's good news for church plants, because unless you're a real anomaly, most church plants start small. That's good news if you are an established church that has an established congregation in a very specific spot. That's the story of West Bradenton, is 1305 43rd Street West. We've been here since 1962, I think, 1963. And we haven't moved. So the people around us have changed because the community has grown, and there's different people here as there were in the 1960s. So there's always more people to reach, more places to go. Churches tend to be imbalanced. The ones that are outwardly focused tend to either focus on the nations to the neglect of the neighborhood, or on the neighborhood to the neglect of the nations. And so you need to be doing both. Unfortunately, I think the vast majority of churches aren't even focused on the mission of God. They're not doing the work of evangelism locally or cross-culturally. They're not doing the work of outreach locally. Most churches are quite happy with the status quo. And it's an opportunity. We are in a great spot in terms of where the culture is right now to reach the people around us. And I think that more churches should catch that desire. And one of the ways that starts is just even knowing who's in your community. Another thing that churches tend to grossly underestimate are the number of single moms or single dads, mainly single moms in most communities, but there's single dads too. And there's I find most communities, 1 in 3 or 1 in 2 homes are single parent homes. Well, what does that mean? I mean, that's a huge ministry opportunity. The only way that you're going to know that is to look at a demographic report, to study the data. And I think that that's a good missiological principle. I think Jesus studied the culture. I think the disciples studied the culture. Now, it was a movement of the Holy Spirit, and nobody is regenerated apart from the work of the Holy Spirit. But we're still called outward, and we're still called to reach people, and we're still called to a place of obedience where we share. And to go into a community, to go into a culture completely ignorant of that community, or completely, willfully ignorant of the context, well, that's not being a good missionary. Good missionaries study. They learn the culture. Part of learning the culture is through demographics. Not the only way, of course, but it is a huge part of it's the starting point of who are these people and that I'm called to reach and what drives them. And very important questions that every church needs to know. That's why we created the Know Your Community report at Church Answers, is because every church needs to know their context, every single church. And we want to be a part of helping churches do that.
Amen. You said something very important. It opens up, the next idea, the next issue is baby boomers. It's a generation that's retiring the fastest and stuff like that. The largest living generation, I think, in the last time I read, was the millennials, as of 2020 or something like that.
Correct.
So you got a cultural shift. I mean, you got a generational shift that's happening pretty much everywhere around the world, almost at the same time. You got an aging population where everybody's kind of like, not everybody, but like a large group of people in many nations that are just getting older and older. And it's true. People get older. Look at me. I'm getting older. You know what I mean? Everybody gets older, but not like this. I don't think we ever seen this before. If you do, you look at South Korea, they have a huge population of senior citizens. Italy, Japan, I think Japan is the oldest in the world in terms of population, in terms of senior citizens, the population of senior citizens. Russia has a bunch of aging population. And then America is kind of creeping up there as well. Now, when you just look at the data and be like, okay, it's a lot of senior citizens population. Okay. Now, when you step back and be looking at it, you'll be like, okay, logically, mortality will happen, right? This generation will pass away and the new generation will happen, right? A new generation will take over with the millennial and alpha. And the baby boomers, the silent generation, and all these other generations that are still here are going to go away, logically, sooner or later, by 2025, 2035, 2040, maybe is the last for certain generations. And then all of a sudden, if you do the math, it's like, boom, like there's going to be a huge like dip. You know what I mean? More in some countries, more than others. Even Elon Musk, who actually sees this as a problem, he actually tweeted and say, somebody asked him, what is the problem in the future? And they said, is it global warming? And he's like, no, it's not going to be global warming. It's going to be population collapse. There's not going to be enough people. And I'm like, wow, that kind of, makes sense. If you look at the data, it potentially makes sense. Now, he could be wrong. The data could be wrong. But if you just stick with the data and what that guy says, then I'm thinking, well, it kind of makes sense. But when you apply this to churches and you look at the aging population at churches, the Church of England, the Episcopal Church, some Presbyterian church, some Baptist churches, some Methodist churches that are just population-wise in terms of church membership is aging populations. You know what I mean? The Church of England, that has a major impact in early American colonialism. They only reach like 2% of the youth in England and Scotland. You know what I mean? Which is vastly low. I read in the Telegraph one time last year that if this happens continually, that the Church of England will supposedly disappear by 2035, which is like, if I went back in time and told J.C. Ryle that, if I went back in time and told some of the church fathers that, in the English Reformation, they would have been like, there's no way that the Church of England would disappear. Now, some people would, let them disappear. You know what I mean? But stuff like that. What are your thoughts about an aging church population in relationship to the aging world population?
Yes, I think you're correct. Countries generally are getting older, although there are certain parts of the world that are growing and growing rapidly. Nigeria is one, for example, and many think that the population of Nigeria will overtake that of China in coming years, which is hard to fathom. India is growing as well. But there's certainly a problem of an aging population in the United States, Japan, and other places, as you have mentioned. Part of the reason for the aging of the United States population in other places is declining birth rates. People are just not having as many children. What has staved off an utter collapse of the population decline in the United States is immigration. And in order for our nation to do anything in the future, we're going to need not less immigration, but significantly more immigration to counter what are declining population trends and birth rates of people who are, born here. And all of the growth in the United States, the last 10, 15 years is ethnic minorities. The white population in the United States actually declined for the first time since 1790 with the latest census. So all of the growth in the United States is ethnic minorities, mainly Hispanics, Black people as well, some in the Asian community, but the vast majority of population growth in the United States is Hispanic. And
Latinos,
I use that term, yeah, I use that term Hispanic. I know not everyone identifies with the term.
It's all right,
It's a Latino, Hispanic. I say it because that's the demographic term. That's what we're talking about. Sure. And I realize that if you're like a third generation person that's here, you may not say you're Hispanic. So for those who are listening, I do understand the difference. I'm just, for the sake of a podcast, I've got to use a term. That's the one I'm using. So it's a very important thing, and it's something that we've noticed in our church. I mean, 40% of our community here in Bradenton is ethnic minority, and most of that is Spanish speakers or those who are of Hispanic origin. So, if the church is going to change and adjust in the future and do well in the United States, well, it needs to be more multi-ethnic. The youngest generation is by far the most diverse generation. You're talking Gen Z, and then this alpha generation that's coming up that we know very little about because they're very, very young. But millennials, certainly more diverse than boomers. Gen Z, even more diverse. Let me give you some stats here since we're talking demographics.
Please.
So my grandparents came of age when the United States was 85 to 90% white. Just let that kind of sink in. So if you're 85, 90 years old, you came of age when the United States was 85, 90% white. Now, the United States will be minority white in just a few short years. Preschools are already minority white. So we've seen a massive shift. People of color represent so much more of the United States now. Now, I champion that. I welcome that. I think that's great. Immigration has saved this country demographically. Without immigrants, our economy would be absolutely devastated. Most people don't realize that. The labor force is the growing. Every bit of the labor force growth will occur because of Hispanics. And most people don't see that. So without that, we would be in a very difficult spot here in the United States. Now, what does that mean for the church? Well, it's very basic. Guess what? You're called to reach them, to reach people for Jesus, and to make disciples who make disciples. So your Spanish-speaking ministries, if you have them, as we have them here at West Bradenton, are going to become much more important. And if you are resigned and dedicated to being an all-white church, well, in most communities, that's not going to work for you in about 30 or 40 years. Now, in some communities in the upper Midwest, you could always point out some exceptions. Hey, we're 95% white here. Okay, great. Then just reach your community. Then 95% of your church should be white. You should just reflect your community. And a lot of people push back on that. And I would just say, I think it's a good missiological principle. It's a good ethics. If you know your community, you're reaching your community, your church is going to reflect your community. You don't have to sacrifice your principles to do that. You certainly don't need to sacrifice your doctrine. You should not. Stay true to the word of God. Ecclesiologically, which is what this podcast is about, you don't have to sacrifice your ecclesiology to reach people. But you do need to do the mission of God. You do need to do the work of God. You do need to get out there to do outreach, to do evangelism, and to bring people into the church, assimilate them into the body, make disciples who make disciples. These are very basic missiological principles. And because of the political climate and because of race issues in the United States, which are still present, sometimes people push back on that. I understand there's some sensitivities there, and there's a lot of hurt and pain that has been associated with some of these racial divides in our country. But the church should be a place where the healing takes place. And, we've certainly seen some great things happen at West Bradenton, my church. We have 6 services on a Sunday morning, 2 languages, 2 campuses, 4 preaching pastors. I'm one of them. I preach 3 of the services, 3 of the 6. But we have two Spanish-speaking pastors, and they're awesome. And one of them knows a little bit of English. The other one knows very little English. And sometimes it makes staff meetings a little interesting because we need a translator. But it's beautiful. And I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't change it at all. And because we have a significant amount of people in our community that don't know English as well. They're learning it. But there's always going to be a need for a Spanish-speaking service here in this part of the world, because you have people coming into the country that just, they want to learn English, but they don't know it well. Okay, great. Guess what? We need a Spanish-speaking service. That's just basic demographics. Those are the very basic things that I think a lot of churches miss.
Absolutely. I talked to Dr. Javier Chavez last week, and he's from Gainesville. Awesome pastor. He's originally from Peru, and he lives in Gainesville, Georgia. Back in the 90s, it was like, what he told me, it was like 99% white, Caucasian. Now it's over 50% Hispanic, and he has a Latin church, Hispanic church, and all his congregation Hispanics, and they all work at the factories, the chicken factories in Gainesville. So within 30 years or less, the 99% Caucasian rate in Gainesville, Georgia, flipped and went entirely almost half or a little over half Hispanic. So that right there is one example, and that's not even talking about LA, Chicago, or Miami, like he said. This is Gainesville, Georgia. This is like deep South. You know what I mean? And it's happening all over the world, especially here in the United States. Like you're right. I think, what is it, by 2040 or 2050, it's going to be almost half Hispanic. Now, there's a curveball. You ready for the curveball?
Bring it.
They may overturn Roe v. Wade. The birth rates have been impacted in the white Caucasian demographics, Anglo-Saxon, whatever you want to call them, in America, because Roe v. Wade has made major impacts in culture and society, in churches, in corporations. You know what I mean? So with women, white women are having less and less children since then. They have aborted more children since then. And that's sad. And that's very, very sad when you think about that. But when you look at the data, it's like, well, white women are not having as much. Obviously, if you're listening and you have like 10 kids and you're white living in Utah or South Carolina or whatever, you're a statistic, man. You're a statistic. But a lot of the white women, they're not having kids. You know what I mean? They're not, and they're pushing marriage out further and further, which obviously all this kind of impacts. It does touch your birth rates and demographics. But now, with Roe v. Wade that might be overturned in a lot of states, I think Iowa, Oklahoma, they just banned abortion outright recently. Many, maybe 13 to 14 other states might come out and just say it's illegal. And I'm sure there's going to be sanctuaries. Like California is already a sanctuary for pro-abortion. New York State. So I'm sure there's going to be, the coastal line is going to be are going to ban it. Now, this does kind of play with the numbers, maybe, because it may spike spike birth rates. We will see. I'm hoping it will. Because if it doesn't, if this, because I don't think none of this factors in Roe v. Wade being overturned. You know what I mean? Not that I've studied. It just continues as the law of the land, according to the numbers we look at. So the birth, having children, like you said, is a pretty big deal that impacts society. Nations are built on families. You know what I mean? So I feel like congregations in the future also need to start focusing on families in terms of making it okay and building a culture of families is an okay thing to have. I'm not saying pressure women to have kids, but in the sense of making it this is a normal thing. Children are a great thing because, ever since Roe v. Wade, it's been the law, and I think it is still law now, but, is about to get overturned, I think. But back in the day, since it got accepted and made into law, kids were seen as an inconvenient in society. It's, you know what I mean? The womb is a very dangerous place, they say, and all these things. So it kind of downplayed the family. You know what I mean? It was a subtle attack on building family. You know what I mean? And many churches, I went to a couple churches and I have 4 kids, and they're like, wow, you got 4 kids. That's a lot. And I'm like, in Latin America, it's not a lot. My sister has 7. My other homie has 7. I'm actually the one that has less than all my other Hispanic friends. You know what I mean? So it's like, and you're like a white church, and you're telling me that it's weird and why you have so many kids. And I'm like, can you touch on the psychological effects that Roe v. Wade has had in the church in terms of not accepting big families when in the future you may need to accept big families?
Yeah, you brought up a really good point. When Roe v. Wade was occurring in the 1970s, there really wasn't a strong pro-life movement. There was among Catholics, but that was about it. Even evangelical Christians did not speak out as much as they should. That didn't happen really until the 90s. So one, I'm, just for the sake of your listeners who don't know me, I'm strongly pro-life and would fully support the overturning of Roe v. Wade. I believe that it should happen. I realize people are going to disagree with me on that, and frankly, I don't care because life begins at conception. Science has proven that. We need to figure out a way to care for those who are in the womb and not kill them. So one, I hope that happens. I do believe it will. I'm not a Supreme Court watcher. I'm not an expert in this area. That's just my gut, is that it will be overturned and it will go back to the states. Yes, there will be sanctuaries, as you said. How does this impact the church? I'm not a psychologist because I can't really speak to the psychology, but I can speak the demography. You are correct that birth rates will go up if Roe v. Wade is overturned. How much? Well, that's yet to be determined. I hope that happens. Particularly in the Black community, I think you're going to see birth rates go up if Roe v. Wade is overturned. But all demographics, whatever race it is, you're going to see an increase there. And you're right, white people are having less children. Hispanics tend to have more children. Yet another reason to be thinking about Spanish-speaking ministries in your church. But let's assume that Roe v. Wade is overturned. Let's assume that what I believe would be very good happens. How do you prepare your church? Well, there's an easy way. There is a really easy way that you can do right. Well, I say easy. It's very hard, but it's something that every church can do. That's what I mean by easy, and that's fostering. People ask me all the time. I do these consults all the time. Church like, we're not as connected to our community. How do we get connected to the community? What do we do to get connected to the community? How do we know the people? The people don't want to be here. Blah 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 blah. How do we go to the community? There's lots of things you can do, but the number one thing that you can do is start fostering. Get 2, 3, 4, 5 families in your church to foster and get involved in the foster system. You're going to be connected to every part of the community, the worst problems of your community. You're going to be in front of police officers and judges and caseworkers and guardian ad litems. You're going to be in front of families that are in need. You're going to have children in your church that are experience trauma. You're going to be connected to like everything in your community. Rural, urban, suburban, whatever the racial mix is, whatever the whatever generational mix you have in your community, every community has needs when it comes to the foster system. So foster children. That's the best thing that you can do. And oh, by the way, let's assume Roe v. Wade is overturned. Guess what? There's going to be a lot of people, mothers and fathers, who will have children but don't want them. Somebody's going to have to take them. So fostering and adoption are going to become significantly more important. Crisis pregnancy centers will become significantly more important. These things don't go away with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. In many ways, that's the starting line. And you can get your church ready right now by starting a movement of fostering. That helps you in so many ways. And you will be far ahead of any other church in 10 years when it comes to what's going to happen to families. And oh, by the way, when you welcome foster children, you focus on families. And by focusing on families, you're encouraging something that's very important to the life of the church. It has completely revolutionized West Bradenton. We started fostering. At any given time, we have 20 plus foster kids in the church. And our children's ministry has almost quadrupled since that time. So 35% of our church is 18 and under now. And I credit that to what began with fostering. How do we get younger as a church? How do we get younger? No kids will come here. Well, guess what? If you foster, they will be there. And you don't have to be 25 years old to foster. Man, I can point to you foster stories where it's retired people and they take foster children in, and because they have the time and they have the means of being able to care for children. So maybe you're 65 plus and you're wondering what your next ministry is. I would say you probably need to pray about fostering.
Wow, that's a blind spot that many churches are. I think one of your quotes I posted on my Twitter feed, it was like, we haven't tried that yet. The 7 words that our dying church would say. I probably butchered it. Let me see if I could find it. But
I think we've never done that before. We've never done that.
Yeah, it
is 7, and I'm misquoting myself.
I have it right here. It says, "We never done that way before. We never done it that way before."
There we go.
It's often cited as the last 7 words of a dying church. End quote. I thought it was a fabulous thing because many churches are trying to swim in the middle of a cultural shift. You know what I mean? So obviously there's a lot of political reasonings why they want immigration here. It's a divided issue. It's a heated issue. But for the church's perspective, when you bring it back to the realm of ecclesiology, and think about, okay, the Lord, actually, this is, like you said earlier, it's a great opportunity. It's a gift to the church. It's probably the most optimistic thing you could probably talk about in terms of missions, evangelism, and revitalizing the church, like to use your terminology, is that the Lord is bringing, a certain group, a certain number of people to the United States. He's bringing the world here in a sense. And America has a history of having the world here, with the Irish immigration. You got the Italian immigration. You have all kinds of groups throughout the 20th and 19th century, right? And now you have like tons of Central Americans, tons of people from the Caribbean, islands, and South America, primarily Central America, coming thousands and thousands over the border. And, politically stuff aside, Christian stuff in the center, if you really think about it biblically, you're like, wow, okay, so this is a huge opportunity. I think we talked about it. You mentioned that your church has experience in it. What should, how can churches get involved in this? How can they reach these groups of people that are migrating here? What are some of the ways that these pastors could prepare for the inevitable 50% Hispanic, or over 50% Hispanic, and like you said, the Caucasians being the minority? How can these predominant white churches, because it's going to happen. Boulder, Colorado is going to be 40% Hispanic sooner or later, because Aurora, Colorado, Denver, outside of Denver, is mostly Hispanic. You know what I mean? Pueblo, Colorado is mostly Hispanic. You know what I mean? And all these, Phoenix, you go there, it's like mostly Hispanic. You know what I mean? Chicago, New York is a mixing pot. You know what I mean? And so like you have to really go in the middle of nowhere, like maybe somewhere in the middle of Pennsylvania, and then you'll be surrounded. But it's not the norm. That's not the norm. Even Hershey, Pennsylvania is mostly Hispanic. At least the rural area. Because a lot of these workers are rural workers. They work the lettuce. They work the lettuce fields, the strawberry fields, the avocado field, the soybean fields. You know what I mean? Right? Because they can't go ahead and apply for Wells Fargo. You know what I mean? They're not going to work for Wells Fargo. They're going to work for the lettuce field. You know what I mean? So what are some of the strategies these predominant white churches can start doing so they could be prepared, so within 20, 25, 30 years, they won't, be dealing with such a huge impact of potentially closing their doors?
Yeah, it's a great point. So your first generation immigrants tend to work more manual labor jobs, but those who are second and third generation tend to be middle class. And one of the things that we've seen in the Bradenton area is poorer whites moving out and middle class Hispanics moving in, renovating the homes that are there. And actually gentrification means that the white population has been pushed out and more middle class Hispanics are moving in. So there's always going to be a need for that immigrant, that migrant, that person that's here, that's brand new and just learning, like, I'm in a strawberry field, like, and that's a significant portion of people. But there's also a rising middle class among the Hispanic community that, for the most part, if you're a second or third generation person of this country, particularly if you're an American, a lot of them consider themselves American, you're going to speak English. So the language barrier is not there for a large portion of those who are not white. So I'll just say, let's remove ourselves from the language barrier. That could easily be solved by, well, you support missionaries, right? Oh yeah, we support missionaries. Bring in a local missionary, bring in a Spanish-speaking missionary to your own church and have them reach your community. So if you support missionaries, well, you could do that locally. That's one solution there. If you're willing to send somebody to Nigeria, that's great. I hope you do. That's a growing country, and they need people there. But then why can't you send somebody to your own community? Why can't you bring in a local missionary to reach the people around you? So if you're looking to cross the language barrier, that's one way to do it. But let's assume that you're going to reach those who speak English. Invite people to church. Start with the schools. We've adopted several schools around here, and we help teachers, we help students, and we just help whoever. Well, a good portion of them, because the youngest generation is minority white, a significant portion of them are people of color. Guess what? If you're doing gospel work among the youngest generations, that's who's going to come into your church. So if you want to solve a problem 25 years down the road, you're not going to solve it with your 80-year-olds, your 70-year-olds, and your 60-year-olds. Man, if God sends you Hispanic people that are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and your church is filled with them, that's awesome. I champion that. I don't want to neglect those kinds of ministries, but most churches, just practically speaking, are going to grow with the youngest generation. So focus on the schools, focus on where they are, and just do outreach like you would with anybody, whatever race they may be. And just also realize that you are going to have to change as a church, because the Hispanic culture in most communities is a little different than the white culture. It's not worse or better. It's just different. So your church, the one way to shut all this off is to say, we want you to come into our church, but we don't want to change our church culture. Well, you're never going to reach people like that. You won't reach anybody like that. You're going to have to be willing to change your culture. Choir is going to look a little different if you have a choir. Children's ministry is going to look a little different if you have children's ministry. Some of your events may look differently. And if you're not willing to do that, well, you're not willing to do gospel work. You're not willing to do the work of an evangelist. You're not willing to do the work of a missionary. So a couple of things there. You can hire somebody just as a missionary. If you're like, hey, we want to cross the language barrier, well, you would do that in your own community just like you would in another country. You can focus on children in the schools and just reaching the schools. And if you do that, likely you're going to see an increase of ethnicity in your church. And thirdly, you have to be willing to change the culture of your church. If not, well, you're not going to reach anybody. And I don't think any church should die. I think God wants every church to thrive. I don't like hearing people say that church should die. I think every church, if God can save any person, he can save any church. But that being said, if you choose to die, well, there's not much we can do. So some pretty basic things there. Guess what? Hispanic kids are not all that different than the white kids. They're kids. I mean, there's some nuances there, of course, culturally. They play video games. They like the same sports. They're just kids. So guess what? Reach the kids. That's all you got to do.
And lastly, when people talk about demographics, they tend to get into the politics and to the political theory pretty much right away. And churches have been recently dealing with this. I think, according to my study, 2013 is when you started to see this flesh out, and more recently, more and more. And there's a lot of temptation that comes with this too. I get it. Peer pressure as well. But when you study demographics in your neighborhood and you want to connect with your culture, for example, that's around you, there's a temptation that comes to churches and certain pastors, even missionaries, to assimilate to that culture, to sacrifice the gospel, to sacrifice truths, essential truths of the gospel for the sake of making peace with your neighbors, for the sake of making peace with non-believers, should I say, or making peace with the state, for example. Whatever, you fill in the blank. What do you have to say against that? Why is that a slippery slope? Why is that a temptation? Because when many churches, they study demographics and they're like, well, for example, the buzzword, the BLM stuff, you know what I mean? And all of a sudden they get into that and, racial reconciliation and not to say, America has a perfect, clean past, but to say they go so far in a sense where they sacrifice the complete gospel and, you know what I mean? And they get involved so much. And it's like, you kind of got lost in that sense, looking at where your church has gone from being confessional and reform, maybe evangelical. And all of a sudden, it feels like, it kind of sounds like you kind of embraced it so much so that what team are you on in that sense? Like, why are you know what I mean? So can you give some of that warning to many people who are going to study demographics in the modern sense? Of the dangers of that?
Yeah, I'll be glad to. And just so I show my cards, I'm going to give this from a conservative perspective because I tend to lean more conservative theologically, politically, economically. So I'm not afraid to tell people what I think. I certainly don't want to make enemies, but what I'm about to share comes from that perspective. So I just want everyone to know that. I don't know your audience. So what you're about to hear comes from me, one person. You can politicize anything. And we have as a country. And you can polarize anything. I mean, literally anything. And I would just say what often causes churches to not build bridges is fear. You look at something like BLM or CRT, critical race theory, or any of these things that are out there that are very polarizing. Well, you can use those as wedges. Certainly you can. You can take Black Lives Matter and make that an issue in your church. You can take critical race theory and make that an issue in your church. I would encourage you not to. I would encourage you to listen. If you have part of the Black community that really kind of leans into CRT, although I would say it's more of an academic thing. You're not often going to find people at ground level that are talking about this, but it seems to be something that's out there. Well, just sit down and listen with someone. Maybe you'll learn that, like, okay, I disagree with them on these 3 or 4 things, and I disagree with them pretty heartily. But there's 6 or 8 things that I actually agree with them on. We'll focus on the points of agreement to build bridges so that you can share the gospel. I have certain political opinions. I feel very strongly about free markets. I'm a free market capitalist. I'm not a big fan of government regulation, but I'm also smart enough to know that as a pastor, for the most part, that's not a biblical issue. Like, it's just not. So while I'll vote a certain way and I'll support candidates myself, as a pastor and as a missionary and as somebody who's trying to reach my community, there's certain things that are biblical, certain things that aren't. So you have to have discernment on, okay, I disagree with this person politically, but this really isn't a biblical issue. Free markets, that you're not going to find free market capitalism in the Bible. As much as I love it, it's not there because it wasn't even invented yet. So I would just say, one, get out of the echo chamber. If all that you're doing is getting your news from the social media algorithm, guess what? It rewards things that you like. So you're only hearing one side. So get out of the echo chamber. Listen. If you have an issue with something, let's say CRT, well, go read Cone. Go read the people that came up with this thing. Go read the actual source documents. Make your own opinions. It's like Calvinism. I can't tell you how many Calvinists I've met that've never read Calvin's Institutes. Like, okay, go read them. Or people who are opposed to Calvinism. Like, I can't stand that. Okay, why? Have you read the Institutes? Go read the source documents. Find out more about it. Listen, understand. You're probably still going to disagree with some of this stuff, but at least you'll be able to know how to build bridges better. So when things get polarized and politicized in the church, step 1, ask yourself, is this a biblical issue? Pro-life issues? I do believe it is. Things like free market capitalism? No, I don't. Where a road needs to go in your community, or whether that road needs to be widened or not, yeah, that may be a hot issue in any local community, but it's not a biblical issue. So stick to the biblical issues. Don't be part of the polarization. Build bridges, don't burn them. And even when you find that you disagree with somebody politically, you can still reach out to them. You can still talk to them. You can still listen to them. And I think a lot of people view your enemy is not flesh and blood. Your enemy is not your neighbor. Your enemy is not the opposing political party. Your enemy is the powers of darkness, and we often lose sight of that in the church. So I say this as somebody who is pretty strongly conservative in many areas of my life. I'm not going to compromise my doctrine. I'm not going to compromise what I believe to be truth. I'm actually an inerrantist. I believe the whole Bible's true. I'm not going to compromise that. But I can be kind and gracious and loving to my neighbor, and disagree in a way that doesn't burn a bridge, even while sharing the truth. And I think that's the example of Christ. So these are very important issues that you've brought up, and they are things that we cannot ignore as a church. But I also don't think that I think that we can be a calming effect in the community as opposed to adding fuel to the fire.
Last words on trying to convince that pastor who may be on the fence about studying this issue, demographics. 2 minutes. What do you got to say to that pastor who's on the fence to be like, I don't know about demographics?
Well, if you don't know your community, you can't reach your community. And the only way that you're going to understand your mission field is to look at the demographics and the psychographics. There's several ways you can do that. Obviously, I have census data and all sorts of things. But that's why we created the Know Your Community report. So if you're interested, you can go to churchanswers.com, click on the demographic tab, and tell you all about it. I'm not going to do a sales pitch too much here. You can go check it out if you like. And I would just say, be willing to learn, be willing to listen, be willing to have some of your beliefs of your community be changed, because I bet for most of your listeners, the community is younger than they think, it's more diverse than they think. And they're more single moms than they might realize. So what it will do is it will open your eyes to opportunities for ministry. Again, this gets back to the mission of God, the Missio Dei. And the Missio Dei is a part of ecclesiology. It's a part of how your church operates and how your church governs itself. So at its root, this is an ecclesiological issue because it's a missiological issue. And, missiology flows from ecclesiology and vice versa. You have to have strong convictions on both of those things in order to do the mission of God correctly.
Amen. Where can people find you real quick on social media so I could go ahead and post it so people can find you?
Yeah, the handle is Sam Rainer, SamRainer, Facebook, Twitter. You can find me on Instagram. It's actually Sam S. Rainer on Instagram. Because there's some snow skier out in British Columbia, I believe, that there's another Sam Rainer, and he took my handle. Actually, it's his handle, but he got it first.
Give it back, bro. Give it back.
We've actually interacted some because our names are the same, and sometimes we get each other's emails, which is absolutely hilarious. Wherever he goes to get his hair done, I get those emails.
Oh, wow.
I don't know how that's happened. So
Sam S. being bold again. You're like, what?
Yeah, it's Sam S. Rainer on Instagram. But I just post pictures of my family. So if you're interested in looking at my kids, you can go there.
Hey, man, I'll go ahead and follow you up on all those. Thank you so much for tuning in to Bible Theory and to the next episode. I appreciate you. Don't forget to hit me up on Twitter at the Chicano Knox and follow me on YouTube and support the ministry. Buy me a coffee. I'll drop the link below. But anyways, until the next episode, God bless. Soli Deo Gloria.